National anthem protests continued during Week 7 in the National Football League, although the head count of those kneeling or otherwise acting out during the song has greatly diminished, mirroring media coverage of the actions. Both protesting players and those opposed to their tactics now seem locked in on their respective stances on the righteousness of the protests. The same players who protested in previous weeks either stayed in the locker room, kneeled or sat, while many teams stood and locked arms in a compromise maneuver. On the other side, President Donald Trump keeps trying to stir the pot against their actions, this week by calling on Americans to sign a petition asking the NFL to make it mandatory to stand. The league has merely said players should stand, but has, so far, refused to order them to do so. Fans also register disapproval in various ways, some through stated boycotts, others by turning off their television or not attending games. One fan even hired a plane to fly over the Jacksonville Jaguars stadium during its game with a banner reading, "Be American. Boycott the Jags and the NFL." Meanwhile, most team owners seemingly wring their hands and hope it all goes away, with a few outspoken exceptions. Commissioner Roger Goodell, owners, player representatives and others met in New York for 2 days this week, with declining TV ratings and other signs of diminishing fan interest the main topics. Little to nothing was publicly resolved at the meetings, as players' right to free speech and the desire by owners to have the football business prosper seem on separate planets. There has been some vague talk of providing a platform for player social activism outside of the games, but those plans seem to have little appeal on either side. Former 49ers quarterback Colin Kaepernick, who started the anthem protests last year, added to the NFL woes this week. He filed a grievance with the NFL Players Association over his seeming banishment from the league. Kaepernick, a free agent, has not been signed by any team, even as some quarterbacks viewed as lesser talents in some quarters have been enlisted by teams. He has hired high-profile attorney Mark Garrigus to represent him. In this week's Sunday games, all members of the Carolina Panthers, Chicago Bears, Green Bay Packers, Baltimore Ravens and Jacksonville Jaguars stood for the anthem. However, the biggest protest was again registered by the San Francisco 49ers. For the second week in a row, the 49ers had 7 players kneel. Safety Eric Reed, linebacker Reuben Foster, linebacker Eli Harold, safety Adrian Colbert, cornerback Quan Williams and receiver Marquise Goodwin all took a knee during the anthem. The rest of the 49ers locked arms and stood. Tennessee Titans wide receiver Rashard Matthews remained in the locker room during the national anthem before the team's game with the Cleveland Browns, as he has for 4 consecutive weeks. His teammates stood, but linebacker Wesley Woodyard and defensive lineman Harrell Casey raised a right fist after the anthem. All members of the Browns stood. At Miami, receiver Kenny Stills, tight end Julius Thomas and safety Michael Thomas continued their weeks-long protest, remaining in the tunnel during the national anthem. The Dolphins have instituted a team rule that all players must stand if they are on the sidelines, but gave them the option to remain in the tunnel. The 3 players previously have taken a knee, most prominently in the Dolphins game in London against the New Orleans Saints in Week 4. Their opponents today, the New York Jets, stood as a team with arms locked, joined by owner Christopher Johnson. Speaking of the Saints, most of that team knelt in unity before the national anthem in their game against Green Bay, then rose to stand during the actual song. Several players and coaches locked arms. The Indianapolis Colts continued wearing their black t-shirts during warm-ups. The shirts say "We will" on the front and stand for equality, justice, unity, respect, dialogue, opportunity on the back. However, all players on the Colts stood with arms locked during the anthem for the 3rd week in a row. The sound of the national anthem prompted about 50 people to kneel outside of the Minnesota Vikings US Bank Stadium in Minneapolis in protest of police violence. They drew stares, boos and some limited support from passing fans. According to a news report, the protesters organized chants and held up cardboard signs with "MGOT privilege" and "Stop pretending your racism is patriotism." Inside the stadium, the Vikings had several team members link arms during the anthem, but otherwise stood. In Buffalo, no members of the Buffalo Bills kneeled. However, 4 players stood behind their teammates' line, including Mike Tolbert, Kellen Clay, Sharice Wright and Jarrell Worthy. Panthers vs. Bears. All Panthers and Bears players reportedly stood before Sunday afternoon's game. Titans vs. Browns. All members of the Titans and Browns on the field stood for the national anthem. Titans wide receiver Rashard Matthews remained in the tunnel for the Star-Spangled Banner and then rejoined his teammates after the song. Saints vs. Packers. Saints players knelt in unison before the national anthem for the 3rd consecutive game. They stood with hands over their heart for the anthem. The Packers stood with arms linked during the national anthem. Jaguars vs. Colts. It appears that all players on the Jaguars and Colts stood for the national anthem. Members of the Colts linked arms. Jets vs. Dolphins. All players on the Jets and Dolphins stood for the national anthem. Kenny Stills, Michael Thomas, Julius Thomas stayed in the Miami locker room. Ravens vs. Vikings. It appears that all players stood during the Star-Spangled Banner. Several members of the Vikings linked arms during the national anthem. Before Thursday night's game, Kansas City Chiefs cornerback Marcus Peters sat behind the team's bench on a training table during the national anthem, while linebacker Yuki Maligui sat on the bench during the anthem. Oakland Raiders running back Marshawn Lynch again sat during the anthem, as he has throughout the season.